Welcome to Cedars Unitarian Universalist Church. My name is Michael Cox, and I am your worship associate today at this virtual service with our Reverend Zachary Vincent. As we all know, the verdict in the George Floyd's murder case was announced on Tuesday. One of George Floyd's brothers said this about the verdict. "This is what justice feels like. Gut-wrenching, relief, exhaustion. It's not sweet or satisfying. It's necessary, important, maybe even historic. But only with the passage of time will we know if the guilty verdict in the trial of Derek Chauvin is the start of something that will truly change America and the experience of Black Americans." What does justice feel like? It feels like maybe we can finally take a breath. Let's pause to acknowledge that members of our congregation occupy the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of Coast Salish tribes. The homelands of the Suquamish, Duwamish, Klallam, and Chimicum people were ceded under duress through the Point Elliott and Point No Point treaties. We are grateful guests on these lands and affirm Indigenous sovereignty both past and present. This acknowledgement does not substitute for the need to build authentic relationships with modern-day members of these tribes and to learn about their living culture and history. Our faith community is sustained by the generosity of our members. Your contribution will nourish the spiritual growth of our community through weekly worship and ongoing programs that cultivate connection, belonging, sharing, and caring. Included in the video description and displayed on the screen is information to make a contribution to Cedars through our PayPal account. Please take time now or later in the service to make a contribution to help sustain Cedars. Your gifts are greatly appreciated. Cedars is committed to being a welcoming and inclusive community. In all the beauty of languages, cultures, and skin tones that come together in our uniqueness, we welcome you. In all the ways you experience and express gender, in the beauty of who and how you love, we welcome you. With all the religious and ethical traditions that inform your spiritual life, we welcome you. You're invited to join us today and always with an open mind, a loving heart, and willing hands. Is it heresy to say we need to overthrow our current capitalist and consumer society in order to save our planet from climate change? Many people have suggested this, but this is certainly not the current approach we're using to address climate change. For example, the Biden administration's approach to addressing climate change is a great case study. They talk about technological solutions such as increasing the use of renewable energy, electrifying the transportation grid, capturing carbon before it enters the atmosphere, or increasing our use of nuclear power. They talk about more regulations to shift from fossil fuels to cleaner fuels, and to reduce the source of methane that is released into the air by the production, distribution, and use of natural gas. They talk about using market mechanisms such as carbon tax or a cap-and-trade system. But all of these solutions make the same assumption, that we continue with our current lifestyles. We just need to redirect resources and rely on the good old virtues of American ingenuity and innovation. We will continue to measure progress by the growth in the gross domestic product and encourage people to get out there and buy more stuff. Now, don't get me wrong, I and many of you have benefited from the capitalist and consumer society we live in. Our material lives are generally pretty good. But this, of course, brings up the issue of equity. As many of you know, the U.S. has contributed over 25% of the current greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that are caused for the warming we see on the planet. And over 80% of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere are contributed by the wealthiest 30 nations in the whole world. So who are we to tell the 800 million people living on $2 a day that they do not deserve the same level of material comforts we have? Is it heresy to say we cannot sustain our current patterns of consumption and meet the lofty goals we need to achieve to avoid the worst impacts from climate change, and that those solutions are equitable? But let's be honest. Most politicians, policymakers, or leaders do not want to be the skunk at the party who says we cannot continue our current lifestyle. Maybe I'm wrong, and technology, innovation, markets, and regulations will solve the problem and allow us to continue our current way of life. But if I'm right, are we up for the formidable task of overthrowing the system and the potential sacrifices that may entail from us? But what gives me hope is that I see young people starting to question the sustainability of the current system for themselves and for the health of the planet. Just maybe, we need to start listening to them more. So I dedicate the lighting of our chalice to the courage to step over the line and take the positions that are not popular, but needed to reimagine our future. I think it's called heresy. And UUs have a long history of stepping over the line.
As we come together to worship, we remind ourselves to treat all people kindly because we are one family, to take care of the earth because it is our home, and to live lives full of love and goodness because that is how we will all become the best that we can be.
When I Before I offer our call to worship today, I want to share just a few announcements with all of you. The first is today at 1:30 p.m., members and friends of Cedars are invited to participate in a day of service at the West Sound Wildlife Shelter. In addition, this month, Cedars is also taking up a special collection for the West Sound Wildlife Shelter. People are encouraged to participate in both the service and the special collection. For more details on how you can participate in these two activities, please see the latest edition of The Beacon. The second announcement I wanted to share with everyone is to let you all know that on May 2nd, so next Sunday at 12 p.m., folks are invited to gather at the Sage parking lot across from the Island School where we would meet in person for a social hour time hosted by the newly reinvigorated Committee on Ministry. This is a time for people to get together to check in with myself, members of the Committee on Ministry, have a cookie or two and a cup of coffee, as well as to just socialize with each other and begin the process of slowly reconnecting with one another. So I imagine, like many of you, the verdict that came in the Derek Chauvin trial on Tuesday represented a moment of joy and also sadness. Sadness because the trial had to take place in the first place. It was almost a year ago that George Floyd was killed by Derek Chauvin, a murder that set many cities across our country on edge as protesters took to the street. And now here we are all these months later to finally have a verdict and to have Derek Chauvin convicted. Despite this moment, I think it's important for us to remember that there is still work to be done. This conviction does not represent an end of racism or white supremacy. It doesn't represent a reform of the police, which has been demanded since George Floyd's death. And so I want to encourage all of you. Yes, pause and savor this moment. Take it in. It's an important moment in our history as a country. But let us not forget that there is still work to do. And as people of faith, we are called to do that work together. And so as I invite us into this space of worship, invite you to settle your mind. Take a deep breath with me. Center yourself in this moment, in this community, in the values that we hold dear together as we join together today to worship. Come, let us worship together.
Hello. I want to tell you a story today about Christians about 1800 years ago. Maybe this is an unlikely story to hear in a UU service, but I think it has important lessons for us today. So this story starts in about the year 315. And in the year 315, the Roman Empire finally decided that Christians were legal and that they could speak in public about their faith. In the hundreds of years before this, Christianity existed and there were Christians, but they were very quiet because they could be prosecuted and attacked for their faith, maybe even killed. But in about the year 315, that began to change, and the Roman Empire began to look favorably on Christians. And what do you think happened when Christians could start to talk about their faith in public? They started arguing. A lot. They started arguing, in particular, in these years, about the divinity of Jesus. Christians at this time got really, really worked up about the divinity of Jesus. There were different ideas about whether Jesus was co-equal with God the Father or whether he was slightly below that. Still a God, but the Son of God, and so not quite as godlike as God. That sounds a little confusing, but at the time, people were very, very worked up about this. And this was particularly happening in a city called Alexandria, where two different people represented the two sides. And on one side was the Bishop Alexander. That might give you a hint on which side he was on. He was on the official side, the powerful side. He was the bishop of the entire city, and he believed that Jesus was co-equal with God. On the other side was a man named Arius. Arius wasn't a bishop. He wasn't even a deacon. He was in the church, but he didn't have much power. But what Arius had was his voice. Arius was a very good public speaker, and he also wrote poems, and he sang songs about how Jesus was important. Arius never said that he wasn't, but he wasn't co-equal to God the Father. Arius attracted a very different kind of audience. He would tell stories down on the docks to dock workers and to sailors. He would go to the markets and tell them to the vendors and the bakers and all the women who were in the markets. And he became really popular. People liked his poems and people liked his songs, and they found his ideas convincing. And so in Alexandria, in the years of the 300s, Christians began to argue. And they didn't just argue with their words. There were brawls in the city. People fought with their fists over the nature of Jesus. The Roman Empire liked Christians because they were good to people and they helped the poor and they helped the sick. But the Roman Empire didn't much care for fighting in the streets, unless they were the ones doing the fighting. And so the Emperor Constantine said, this has to stop. And he said this to Bishop Alexander. And so Bishop Alexander called a council. And a council is basically a very, very big committee meeting with all of the bishops in the world, as many as could come. And so bishops from all over the world came to a place called Nicaea. And they sat down and they argued and they talked about the divinity of Jesus. Now, you know who wasn't invited to the Council of Nicaea? Arius. Arius was not invited because Arius wasn't a bishop, so he wasn't important enough. So Arius wasn't there to represent his ideas. And in fact, Bishop Alexander and the people who wanted to stop Arius used the poems and the songs against him to say, this guy Arius is a heretic. This guy Arius might even be an agent of the devil. He must be stopped. And so the bishops listened and they learned, but they didn't really learn from both sides. They got one point of view, the official point of view. And that official point of view won. And so the bishops that gathered at the Council of Nicaea put forth something called the Nicene Creed. And the Nicene Creed says that there is a Trinity and all the aspects of God are co-equal. That became the official position. And the Nicene Creed is still said by Christians in churches all around the world today. So Arius lost. His ideas became called a heresy. And he was required to stop speaking. And so he mostly did. But his ideas didn't go away automatically. It took hundreds and hundreds of years for the official Catholic Church to stamp out the ideas that Arius had put forward. And they mostly finally did, at least officially. Although I imagine a fair number of people think Jesus is a very important person, but not quite equal to God. But that's not the official story. So the official story, put forth by the powerful church, supported by the powerful empire, is what won. And the opposing side, even though they had songs and poems on their side, even though they may have had some good ideas, they lost. And so it's worth thinking today, what do we take for granted as the official story, as absolutely right, because that's how it's always been? And where are those heresies, maybe in poems and songs and stories, that we need to hear, that we need to listen to again? Maybe the story of Arius and his followers still have something to teach us today. And that's my story.
For our spiritual moment today, I want to offer these words by Andrea Hawkins Camper. Blessed are we who gather with open hearts together in this space. Blessed are we, the chalice lighters of resistance, justice, love, and faith. Blessed are we, the heretics, the outcasts, the walkers of our own way. Blessed are we, the border crossers, the refugees, the immigrants, the poor, the wanderers who are not lost. Blessed are we, the transgressors, the trespassers, the passers-by, the cause takers, the defiant, the compliant. Blessed are we, the hand extenders, the sign makers, the protesters, the protectors. Blessed are we, the trans women, the trans men, the non-binary, the cisgendered, the multigendered, the no-gendered. Blessed are we, the friend, the stranger, the lonely, the hidden, the visible, the authentic. Blessed are we who rise in solidarity. Blessed are we who cannot. Blessed are we who do not. Blessed are we, for this is our beloved community, and this is who we are. Blessed are we this day and in the days to come. Amen.
Paul and Silas bound in jail, had no money for to go their way. Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on. Paul and Silas began to shout, jail door opened and they walked on out. Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on. Hold on, hold on, hold on, hold on, hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on, hold on. Well, the only thing that we did wrong, stay in the wilderness much too long. Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on. The only thing that we did right was the day we started to fight. Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on, hold on, hold on, hold on, hold on, hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on, hold on, hold on, hold on, hold on, hold on, hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on, hold on, hold on. Got my hand on the freedom plow, wouldn't take nothing for my journey now. Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on. The only chain that we can stand is the chain of hand in hand. Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on, hold on, hold on, hold on, hold on, hold on, hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on, hold on, hold on, hold on, hold on, hold on, hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on, hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on, hold on.
The word orthodox is defined as conforming to what is generally or traditionally accepted as right or true, established and approved. This word has been used to describe a variety of things, politics, people's dress, but is perhaps best known in the context as it applies to religion. Think of Orthodox Christianity or Orthodox Judaism, for example. In both of these examples, both of these examples of religious expression, emphasis is placed on upholding the traditional or established views within these groups. In these settings, to break from the true can cause someone to be ostracized or otherwise put out until they rectify their unorthodox behavior. But where does these right or orthodox views come from? Where does orthodoxy come from in the first place? One example of the foundation of an orthodoxy can be found by turning to the story of Arius that Catherine shared earlier. Arius lived in a time when the orthodoxy of the Christian church was still being established. He was one of the many who was called by the emperor to Nicaea to engage in a debate to help define the accepted beliefs within the Christian religion. Up until this point, the umbrella of Christianity encompassed many different views, some of which are still present today and some of which have long been forgotten. In other words, at the time of Arius, there was no unified or orthodox definition of Christianity. And that is why everyone, including Arius, was called to Nicaea. In time, though, those who were engaged in the debate at Nicaea began to come to a consensus, or through debate, threat, and coercion, most of those who gathered at least began to reach a consensus. They started to articulate what was a Christian belief and what wasn't, to set the orthodoxy. The product of this process was captured in a creed that many of us have heard of called the Nicean Creed. This statement tried to capture the accepted beliefs according to the council and thus form the orthodoxy of Christianity. However, despite the pressure towards conformity placed on those who gathered, not everyone agreed to the tenets that were laid out in the Nicene Creed. The most notable objector was Arius, who happened after the council to be exiled for his disagreement, and upon being exiled was labeled a heretic. Essentially, the label of heretic denotes someone who engages in heresy, or breaks from the accepted or orthodox view of any given group. In this case, it was the Christian church. The objections that Arius raised at Nicaea were so unpalatable to this new definition of Orthodox Christianity that even 150 years after Arius' death, Emperor Theodosius II had a statue of Arius erected in the Roman Forum. But the statue was not meant to be a place for people to come and pay homage. In fact, the statue was placed among those of 2 other heretics, so 3 in total, including Arius. And it was actually a place for the Roman citizens to come and to spit upon the image of Arius and the other heretics represented. 150 years after his death, people were still so upset by the points he had raised that they paid to build a statue for people to spit at. It's a long grudge. The figure of Arius and the views that he represented are of historic significance to us as Unitarian Universalists. Inspired by his teachings, the early Unitarians in Transylvania rejected the notion of the Trinity and affirmed the humanity of Jesus, as well as the unity of the Godhead. Much like the views put forth by Arius centuries earlier, this proclamation of Unitarianism was labeled a heresy. Even among the fledgling Protestant religions that had begun to spring up at the time throughout Europe, Lutheranism, Calvinism, and the like, Unitarianism, the idea of a united Godhead, was seen to go just a little bit too far, and that's why it was seen as a heresy. The heresy of Unitarianism isn't the only heresy that informs our Unitarian Universalist faith, however. At one point, Universalism was also considered a heresy. The idea that God was so loving and good that they wouldn't condemn anyone for eternity didn't sit with many within the Orthodox understanding of Christianity. And so, these people were labeled as heretics. Despite the basis of Universalism being the view that everyone would be saved, there were some different ways of interpreting this. 2 views within Universalism that have always interested me and were seen as heresies even among many of the Universalists were the view of ultra-Universalism and the other view known as Restorationism. Ultra-Universalism is summed up by as Clarence Skinner puts it, as a view that encourages people to make the world a little bit less like hell, and to work to include more people in the paradise that already existed here on earth, that The goal was to make the world slightly less like hell and to somehow include more people in whatever was good here. This particular view is oftentimes critiqued because of its tendency to completely gloss over all of the pain and trauma that existed in the world and jump straight to the conclusion of hope. That it wasn't so much concerned about all of those other things, but really wanted everyone just to have a good life. Restorationists, on the other hand, had a view that oftentimes embraced this understanding of pain, heartbreak, and violence that many of us have experienced in the world. And through recognizing it, commit ourselves to a continued engagement with these matters. The idea being that through staying present to these hard realities, that our world could be restored and brought back to wholeness. For our restorationist forebears, there was no clear mechanism for how this restoration would take place. But theologian Reinald Niebuhr tries to shed some light on this view when he writes, "Nothing that is worth doing can be achieved in our lifetime. Therefore, we must be saved by hope. Nothing which is true or beautiful or good makes complete sense in any immediate context of history. Therefore, we must be saved by faith. Nothing we do, however virtuous, can be accomplished alone. Therefore, we must be saved by love. No virtuous act is quite as virtuous from the standpoint of our friend or foe as it is from our standpoint. Therefore, we must be saved by the final form of love, which is forgiveness." This quote is said to capture the belief of the restorationists and to sum up their understanding of universal salvation. The heresies that I have spoken about, Arianism, Unitarianism, Universalism, both ultra and restorationists, are all heresies that are part of our religious heritage as UUs. They represent distinct points in theological history where individuals and groups chose to break from the orthodoxy of the day and proclaim new truths. Since the time when our religious ancestors first put forth these heretical views, much has changed. Universalism, for example, in a variety of different forms, is now a common view among many liberal Christian churches. Sure, some denominations, some evangelicals still consider this view to be heretical, but for the most part, in the Christian world, it's viewed as a valid or orthodox form of theology. Anti-Trinitarian Unitarianism isn't as widely held as Universalism is today, and yet is still present in many places around the globe. Transylvania, India, the Philippines, South Africa, and England, just to name a few places. In a sense, many of the heresies that were once beliefs to be punished have now become common enough that they have begun to form their own orthodox views. Sure, these orthodoxies don't look the same as their ancient forebearers, but it would be hard to argue that there isn't an orthodoxy within Unitarian Universalism today, a right way and a wrong way. Despite being a small religious group, we have become part of the mainstream culture as Unitarian Universalists. Recognizing this causes me to pause and wonder, what heresies do we need in our congregations today? Where, as Unitarian Universalists, Do we need to break with the orthodoxy of the day and continue to innovate and push the bounds of what is acceptable theologically? In the introduction to the book, Liberation Theologies in the United States, Stacey Floyd Thomas and Anthony Pinn point to the fact that in the nascent United States, religion and religious discourse would function not only as a safeguard to the status quo, but also as a justifier of oppression. Reading this, I see some parallels between the nascent United States and the country that we live in today. And recognizing this, I think we can do better. We need to do better. We need a theology that works to embrace people beyond the status quo of white middle-class society. We need beliefs that cause us to continue to innovate, try new things, and grow from the wisdom of those who aren't currently present in our midst. It's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be hard, but through discomfort and engaging in the hardness of it all comes growth. This is something that the heretics of the past knew. They were willing to risk everything to bring about new ways of being in the world. We need that today. The longer we continue to rest in the comfort of our orthodoxy, the more damage that we are complicit in. So what are you going to do? What are we going to do? What are we going to do to help to protect and restore the environment? What is our role in this issue? What are we going to do to work to end the killing of Black people by the police in this country? As I said, the recent verdict of Derek Chauvin represents hopefully a turning point, but our work isn't done. What are we going to do to prevent more needless killing? What are we going to do to make the world more equitable so people have access to all of those things that we have access to? What do you understand our role to be in bringing about justice? If the answer to any one of these questions is, I don't know, that's okay. It's okay not to know, to admit that we don't know something or don't have an answer. But if the answer is, I don't know, then I invite you to take some time this week. Go and sit outside or in your house somewhere to take some time and to think about what it is that you can do. What is the answer to these questions for you, for us together? The longer that we stew in our own comfort and privilege, the worse that all of these problems are going to get. The people on the other side of these issues from us aren't waiting around. And our waiting is honestly a sign of our own complicity in the issues. Indifference is in itself a form of acceptance and arguably violence. Now is the time we need to reclaim our heretical heritage and do something bold. One of the avenues that I want to begin offering us here at Cedars as we explore these questions and start trying to understand what that bold thing is that we're being called to is a chance to explore some of the various expressions of liberation theology that are being articulated today. Theologies of people beyond the white dominant culture. My hope is that through sermons, through chances for us to gather in small groups and reflect, opportunities for education, that we can collectively can begin to consider perspectives outside of the current orthodoxy of Unitarian Universalism and open ourselves to new ideas and possibilities and perspectives that call us into a deeper sense of interconnection. There's a lot that we can learn from considering the wisdom of theologies beyond our current understanding as Unitarian Universalists. For example, Anthony Pinn reminds us in the book I mentioned earlier, reminds us that Black theology is the affirmation of Black humanity that emancipates Black people from white racism, thus providing authentic freedom for both white and Black people. It affirms the humanity of white people and that it says no to the encroachment of white oppression. How would our conversations around racism change if we let them be guided by perspectives such as the one that Anthony Pinn is offering? How would we change if we pause to get beyond our own orthodoxy and consider things from a perspective other than our own? This is the heresy that we need today. The heresy that calls us beyond ourselves, like the restorationists of the past who sought to engage with the pain and heartbreak and violence of the world. This is what we need, to engage with the things beyond our own understanding, to engage with people who are not currently with us, to bring new ideas, and let that heresy be what guides us. Only through doing this can we find the hope that I believe is the true promise of Unitarian Universalism. The hope that is life-giving and life-affirming. The hope that called each of us to be part of this congregation. May we be so bold together to the glory of life.
Though I may speak with bravest tongue, and have the gift to all inspire, and have not love, my words are vain, as sounding brass, and hopeless gain. Though I may give all I possess, and striving so my love profess, but not begin my love within, the prophet soon turns strangely thin. Come, Spirit, come, our hearts control, our spirits long to be made whole. Let inward love guide every deed. By this we worship and are free.
We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
Our service has ended, but our service to the world and one another begins anew. May we be inspired by the heretics who came before us to engage in our own heresies and continue to challenge the status quo wherever life calls us. May it be so.